Hi teachers, we're here today with Hannah Bryant, who you all know. What you might not know about Hannah is that she's a professional elementary school teacher, and we have her here today at her home to talk about some practical tips and tools that she might have for maintaining classroom order. Just things that might help us when our classrooms are devolving into chaos, when they're already at the point of chaos, and just how to keep things rolling and to deal with disruptions in the classroom setting. So, Hannah, how long have you been teaching grade school?
This is my third year teaching, fourth year being in the elementary setting.
Okay, so. And your first year was younger children, right?
Yeah, my first year was fourth grade, and then now I'm working with sixth grade.
Okay.
So 10-year-olds, now working with 12-year-olds.
Okay. So as a teacher, you have your students for 5 days a week, for 6-7 hours a day?
Yeah, about 7.
Yeah. So what are the particular challenges that we have at Redeemer with only having our students one day for 40 minutes?
So there's definitely challenges that you would experience with 5-day setting that you wouldn't see in the 40, and then vice versa as well. But I think that the most difficult thing with having just the 40 minutes is that you really can only establish so much consistency, because instead of being with those kids every single day, or as a parent, you're with your kids in and out, there's a lot of consistency there.
And like relationality.
Right, yeah, absolutely. As a teacher, we're with these kids for 40 minutes a month, really, and they're in class 40 minutes a week. And so sometimes it can be really difficult to establish ground rules and expectations that are consistent. And sometimes it's really difficult too to build that relationship with kids when you're only seeing them once a month.
Right.
And there's at least 15 to 18 of them, depending upon the group. That I would say that's really difficult sometimes too.
Okay. So just the lack of routine and the lack of relationship in combination.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and so one of the things that we can use to combat that lack of relationship are techniques for grabbing attention and maintaining attention. And you probably don't have to use techniques in games as often in a full-time classroom, but we might have to just pull a lot of them into the shorter class setting. So what are some of your favorite ideas for just really getting the kids' eyes drawn back to you and their ears back to you and getting all of them back into a unified front, basically?
Right. Probably my favorite, because it works for a variety of grade levels and it can be kind of changed depending upon the age, would be just the stop, look, and listen, because it's addressing everything. So typically with pre-K, when they're younger, that's like a stop, you're showing, stop with your hands, and then they're pointing, look, thinking about, looking with their eyes, and then listening.
Okay.
And that's something that, especially with 3 and 4-year-olds, has to be practiced a lot. And so there's probably going to be times where you feel like you're doing it over and over again. But if there's consistency across the board, man, I think it really is worth it. And then with talking about the heart class, the older kids, I think that's something that you can still use. Okay. You might just not use the hand expressions. You might just say, I need you to stop, look, and listen.
Okay.
And then there's that common knowledge, or common language, I should say, where they understand, okay, at that point, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, if I'm working on my craft, if I'm talking with someone, everything stops, and I look. And sometimes even like practicing that, like without even being in the middle of a lesson or being in the middle of something, just sharing like, we're just going to practice this and do it a couple of times is okay, especially when they're just getting used to it.
So even doing play times and craft times,
right?
And that kind of
yeah,
thing.
Absolutely. And that time invested on the front end is going to save you a ton of time, I think, on the back end.
Yeah. So with the littler kids, would you do stop and then wait till they had all stopped, or would you go ahead and move forward to look and hope that the stragglers came and caught on?
Typically I would stop, pause for a minute, kind of make eye contact with those who are struggling, and then go ahead and move forward to the look and listen. But if I'm noticing that there are several who are really struggling with multiple parts of it, we would probably just, oh man, we really kind of had trouble with that. Let's try that again.
Okay, and
And
do it on
then just do
repeat.
the whole thing over again. That
Okay.
way they can practice the whole thing. And the nice thing about having two teachers too is that if that other teacher is kind of in the group with the kids, sometimes just like a hand on the shoulder
Okay.
or eye contact, like I said before, can give them, oh yeah, this is what we're doing.
Just kind of a wake them up call,
Right.
just to be right there beside them and do
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And then in your experience, because you just brought up the assistants, when you have a two-person teaching team, when you're working with an assistant, is it better for one of you to maintain a leadership role through the whole class? Or is it better to kind of tag team and just take turns being the leader in that setting?
I think that it really depends on what the activity is, and some of it depends on who the teachers are as well. So, for example, if it's the core instruction time, sometimes we'll do skits where both teachers are involved, but a lot of times it's just one teacher sharing, about the Bible verse or about the content. And when that's the case, I feel like it's really helpful to have one person that's really just sitting with the kids and is there and is helping to redirect when necessary, or can fluidly, oh, I'm just going to move you over here, and that way it's not drawing attention to it, or at least in the smallest way possible, and it's helping that lead teacher stay on track and stay focused where it's not interrupting the whole lesson. But I know sometimes, like when you're working on craft or if you're doing a game, it's going to make more sense for both people to be involved in leadership, and sometimes that becomes a little bit more fluid of like, okay, I'm giving directions for this, and I'm kind of stepping in and helping. You're giving directions for this and stepping in. But I think the biggest thing, regardless of how you decide to do it, is one, making that decision ahead of time so that there's not that confusion in the moment where you're trying to figure it out. And two, making sure you are communicating with your teaching partner. So maybe you establish, man, this is what really works well for us. We just do better if this one person is leading and the other person is supporting. And maybe you do a lot better where you're both working separate. But I think the key is that the communication is in place so that you're not in the middle of the lesson and you're having to make that split decision.
Right. Potentially offending each other, cutting someone off mid-lesson or something like that.
Yeah.
So ideally, in that early time during check-in, going through the lesson and saying, okay, I'll lead this section, you lead this section, and just figuring it out in that way.
Right.
Create more fluidity.
And I know sometimes it depends upon personalities, who is wanting to maybe lead and who's wanting to support, but I would really encourage you to be willing, especially if you're working with a spouse and this is someone you've consistently worked with for a long time, be willing to try and switch it up, because sometimes you'll realize that you have a skill set or a gifting in an area that maybe you weren't comfortable in before. So,
speaking to 5-year-olds,
yeah.
public anxiety.
Right. I still get anxiety when I'm talking to 12-year-olds and 4-year-olds at times.
So, disruptions and chaos. Does it seem like most of the time when there's a disruption or when the classroom is evolving that it comes down to one or two students? Or is it a class-wide thing? And if it's one or two students, how can you effectively remove the disruption without publicly shaming,
Right.
but at the same time, they'll take you seriously?
Right. I think most of the time, not all the time, I think most of the time it's just a couple that are, and sometimes it feels overwhelming because it's a couple maybe at the same time, but the majority of the time when you're dealing with just one or two students who are having difficulty focusing, or maybe they have their hands on one another, that happens often because they're 3 or 4-year-olds.
Or 9 and 10-year-olds.
Right, yeah, absolutely. But I think that's where it's really helpful to have two teachers. So that person who isn't either leading completely or at least leading currently can quickly go right next to the students. And typically I feel that a strategy that's helpful to you as a teacher and also can resolve the situation is just a quick, hey, I need you to keep your hands to yourself, take care of this. One reminder, and then if they're still having issues within the next couple of minutes, just, I'm gonna ask you to come sit right over here.
Okay.
And either they're spaced pretty far apart, or sometimes it's possible for a teacher to be in between, but a lot of the time that's just not doable because
Right.
you're helping manage everything.
Not very sustainable.
Right, it's not very sustainable. But I really do think that I like what you said about not publicly shaming them. I think for that purpose and just for the success of resolving the situation, a quick, quiet conversation to students is typically way more effective than a, hey, I need you to stop, hey, you're doing this, because a lot of the time they're wanting to draw attention because they're being silly or goofy with the person next to them. Not all the time, but a lot of the time the intent is to draw attention to whatever the behavior is, and so when that's being called out, it's making it worse.
Okay.
But I will say there's been times when I'm teaching pre-K where we're both involved. Like I'm either, teaching and Alex is helping a student already.
Right.
There's enough going on at times that there have been times where I just stop for a second and, hey, I need you to stop. Or, hey, I need you to move. And I think that there's a way to say that in kindness and gently to where it isn't you're doing, it's not speaking harshly, but it's just direct and to the point. It's correcting the behavior rather than correcting the student, if that makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
It does. What you're describing is a very active role of the second teacher. So instead of it being whoever's leading, the other person kind of gets to step out and take a break.
Right.
Really, in that moment that one person is speaking, the other person is probably working more actively. Is what you're describing here.
And their role is, in a lot of ways, as important, if not more important, because you're allowing the instruction to happen. And you had mentioned too, sometimes it's not just a couple of students, sometimes it's many.
Sometimes it's the whole room.
Yeah, right. And especially depending upon like the weather and the day, it just,
Baptism Sundays, when the routine is off,
totally
it's just chaos.
Changes things. So when you're feeling like the whole class is just struggling, oftentimes that's when it's a good time to, okay, we're just going to pause. I want you to stand up on your circle, or if it's heart class, just stand up behind your chair. And pre-K, sometimes that's going to be just like, we're just going to wiggle for a minute, like we're going to jump out and do jumping jacks. Yeah, do a song. Sometimes for heart class, that's going to be like, we're just going to take a minute. You know what? I'm just having trouble like focusing and kind of staying awake this morning. Let's just stretch for a second. Just stretch and just do a couple of stretches. And it seems kind of silly, but that's a way where they're not as, they're a little bit older. It feels a little bit less silly, than wiggling. And sometimes with that older age group, they can take that silliness to the whole level, and then you're not doing yourself a service, you're making it worse.
It's getting more out of control.
Yeah, so sometimes for them, keeping it serious, but giving them that outlet for some movement and a little bit of brain break is really helpful.
For the older kids, that wouldn't have occurred to me. I would have naturally gone to just trying to get more control and get more restraint and get more calm. So you said have them stand behind a chair, and my mind's automatically going, okay, let's have them fold their hands, let's do a silence game. But instead, just continuing to recognize that they're just kids, and they do need to get that energy out. And stretches, that's a really powerful idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then with the last question I have here is, with the restraint of just the 40 minutes a month per teacher and 40 minutes a month per week for the classes, are there little things that you can think of that just are really powerful relationship builders and really powerful ways to make sure that those main points are driven home and the kids know beyond any shadow of a doubt that you wanted to invest in them because you see them as valuable for that day?
I think that's a really good question. I think As far as the relationship piece, one thing that's really nice about the structure that we have for pre-K, and this looks a little bit different for heart class, is that they're coming in gradually. So the nice thing about that is that you have some time where you've got like 2 or 3 in your room, and it might only be like 2 minutes or 3 minutes between that time where more parents are coming. Yeah, but that's a really great time for that quick conversation of like, I remember last week that you said you're going to go to the zoo. Did you go to the zoo? You know, man, I just really love the pattern on your dress today. Is that a new dress? And it's simple and it's small. And even if they're not, even if they would be able to verbalize, man, I really liked that my teacher asked this to me, you know, it gives them that sense of, that warm sense of community and that warm sense of belonging, I think, and that's the goal. And so I think that that's something that's really helpful. And for heart class, it looks a little bit different because you don't have that same transition time.
With all of them arriving at one time.
Right, but I think that the nice thing about the older age group is that if you're doing prayer requests, that's a really awesome time as a teacher that you can be intentional. Even if you're like writing down prayer requests as they're sharing, that means that the next Monday you can come and, hey, so-and-so, I remember that you said this about your grandma, how's she doing? You know, hey, I was thinking about you the other day because you had mentioned this. And that's a really great way where there can be some intimacy that's developed. And again, the neat thing about the heart class is that they're at that age where they're starting to build some deeper friendships with one another too. So while pre-K is going to be pretty teacher-led as far as relationships go, heart class they're able to start to, when you're modeling that, the hope is that that would become a community norm of like, we check in with one another, we ask one another how we're doing, because that's being consistently modeled by the teachers.
Bearing each other's burdens.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that our kids see that in community groups from adults. It's just learning that and practicing that. And then you had said just making valuable use of your time. I think some of that kind of has to come down to like, what are the priorities? There's a lot going on during pre-K and heart class, and I think we've tried really hard to create curriculum where everything has value, but also realizing that, man, there's a value in prayer with one another, and there's a value in them understanding that core objective. It's that truth that they're going to take for the day. Those are the really valuable things. So if it means that, like, the skit flubs up and isn't exactly what you think, you know, or the craft isn't like, there's, you know, it's
just all falls apart.
We know how big the craft can be at times, especially when I'm in charge. But those things are things that's okay. Those are experiences. It's fine if it's not perfect, but really emphasizing and prioritizing the time that you have for that objective and the prayer, because those are those things that are lingering. And so even if you're taking, 10 to 15 minutes, if we're really working hard, that this is a focused time, maybe we lose some focus during these other times. I think that there's a lot of value in that, and I think that is really what has the potential to have a lasting impact, along with the other things coming alongside it.
So really driving home the prayer and relationship and making sure that the focus just stays on that one main thing. It's just to cash in on the little bits of time that we have.
Yeah, because you're right, it does go super fast. Sometimes it feels like it goes really fast.
There are weeks when it's very slow, but there are weeks when it wasn't enough time.
Yeah,
so,
especially for covering everything.
It's a lot to cover. So that's all I had to ask you today, but I really appreciate your input on this. My kids are all tiny. I haven't had experience teaching a classroom full of 9-year-olds. I really don't know what to do. I've never handled 23 4-year-olds at a time before this experience. So having someone with your experience and training is really invaluable. And so I really appreciate this.
Okay.
Thank you so much.